Hey everybody, my guest today is Dr. Haig Nitschke, and we're going to talk about assisted dying. All right, I think a good place to start is for you to explain what your general position is on the issue.
Okay, I've been involved in the issue for a long time, and I suppose that over those 20 or 25 years, my position has certainly changed. And so my position now is quite a bit different to the one that I had initially when I first became involved back in 1995. My position now, which I find one that I've become comfortable with, is one where I believe that people should have the right to peacefully and reliably divest themselves of their God-given gift of life at the time of their choosing, if you're a rational adult. So it's a very broad general criteria. I believe that every rational adult should have the ability and the means to be able to decide if and when they wish to die and be able to carry out that process in an effective and peaceful way. That's a different position than the one that I initially started with back many years ago, where I believe very much that there should be some provision for people who were in serious medical circumstances to have this option.
Okay, so when you talk about assisted dying or assisted death, are you talking about both assisted suicide and euthanasia?
Yeah, pretty well. I mean, the words are often used in varied contexts, but euthanasia generally relates to someone doing something to you. In other words, someone comes along and ends your life, whereas assisted suicide, a doctor or someone, and I'm certainly arguing that it shouldn't necessarily be a doctor, provides you with what you need so that you can carry out that step yourself. And my first involvement with this issue back in 1995 was when the place I worked, the Northern Territory of Australia, passed what turned out to be the world's first euthanasia law, which allowed me as a doctor to give a lethal injection to a dying patient. Even then, I was concerned about that aspect of the process, and I built a machine which allowed it to turn it back into what we describe as assisted suicide. And effectively, I didn't give the lethal injection. The machine gave the lethal injection. The person wanting to die pressed the button on the machine, and the machine turned it effectively back into, if you like, an assisted suicide death. And I've maintained that position. I'm wary about the idea that someone should have to do something to you. And of course, in overwhelming majority of the cases, people can certainly do it themselves if they have the ways and the means and the information to allow this possibility.
Okay, so I kind of want to get an understanding of the more theoretical underpinnings of your position, and then I want to get into the more technical and specific aspects of it. So in regards to the more like theoretical underpinnings, it sounds like that before your position was that the patient had to be suffering or had to be experiencing unbearable suffering. So there was a well-being component that was necessary for a person to access assisted death. But now you're saying it's really just about autonomy. It's not about suffering.
Yeah, that pretty well sums it up. And the reason I had my belief in that first position came about because I more or less inherited the piece of legislation I worked with when it came in 1995. That was the way the law was structured. I thought it made sense, but it was not an issue that I'd spent much time thinking about. I just accepted it. It wasn't until that position was challenged severely by people that I was having conversations with, I found that I couldn't justify that position. That happened a few years into my involvement with the issue, and that's when my position started to change, when I realised I couldn't defend this idea that there was only something that could be justified in the terms of some form of physical or perhaps mental suffering, but certainly suffering in what would be considered to be a medical context.
So why don't you think it's justifiable to require that the patient be suffering?
I was challenged severely by one particular person who I had a long involvement with, and she said, the trouble with you, doctor, is you said you run around the countryside talking to people, but the only people you help are those that you believe satisfy your criteria of when suffering is sufficient. In other words, you dole out your assistance. You're the worst example of insufferable medical paternalism, she claimed. She was a retired academic, an 80-year-old. She told me she was going to die in 4 years because that was 80 at the time to die, and I dismissed this thinking it was just a statement. But she kept asking me for information about drugs in the years leading up to her 80th birthday. And I argued with her saying, look, you're not sick. Lisette Nagot was her name. She was a retired French academic. I said, you're not sick, Lisette. why don't you go on a world cruise, write a book or something? And she said, mind your own business. And that's when she delivered this lecture along the lines that you dole out information to people you think satisfy your criteria of suffering. She said, it's got nothing to do with you, doctor. I make that decision, not you. And of course, she's right. I was suitably mortified by that allegation and accusation and gave her all the information she needed. She said, it's just a matter of fate. I studied something, you studied something else. You've got information and I want it. What gives you the right to decide who gets the information? You set yourself up as a judge and you've got no right to do that. I mean, it was that challenging that made me think, of course, she's right. I shouldn't be running around trying to work out whether or not other people's suffering satisfy my criteria. And as she said, just to keep you comfortable, it's the individual's decision and they make that decision. The only requirement really, she said, and I now accept totally, a person's got to be an adult. They've got to know about the permanence of death and they've got to have mental capacity. They've got to know what it is that they're arguing for. So with those two criteria, adult, mental capacity, of course you should be given access to the means, information, and the ability to be able to divest yourself of this precious gift of life if and when you wish.
So I'm curious to hear your position on other cases in medicine where perhaps the patient is requesting some type of treatment, but the doctors are saying that it's not going to be beneficial. So I remember there was a case that I worked on. I think a patient, he was very skeptical of Western medicine, and he only went to the hospital because his wife kind of encouraged him to, but he didn't want antibiotics. He, for whatever reason, instead he wanted something, I think it was colloidal silver, which he had read on the internet that would somewhat help him. But then the doctors, they weren't willing to do that. And I would say that it's justified for the doctors not to give him colloidal silver because it's based on their judgment that it's not going to benefit the patient. Do you agree with that?
The decision to whether or not he gets his colloidal silver, I presumably is associated with who's going to provide it, who's going to purchase it, where the payment for such treatment is going to be made. And I suppose what I'm really saying here is that I believe that a person should be able to divest themselves of their own life and get the means and ways to be able to do that, but not not at the expense. If it's going to be an expensive process, who's going to have to pay for that? Clearly, that's an issue there, and the issue is whether or not you receive treatment, which is considered to be valueless. The question will come up, well, why should we pay to provide you with something which is valueless just because you think it's a good idea? So I don't believe necessarily that doctors should be running around acting on the opinion of people's own ideas about what will benefit them. I suppose I'm thinking that in the instance of being able to end your own life, this is not a procedure which requires or is likely to cause anything in the way of cost to the community. So it's not as though you're asking for some sort of expensive option here or access to an expensive option which the state can no longer provide. You're asking for simple access to good information, and I would probably argue simple access to very effective and cheap drugs. None of that is going to seriously challenge any of the ability of the state to fund such a process.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think the point that I was trying to make was not necessarily about the cost of a scarce resource, right? The assumption was that doctors are not obligated to give a treatment to a patient if the doctors do not think that that treatment is going to be beneficial. But if you're working with an autonomy-only model, right, then you would think that you would have to fulfill the request of the patient, no matter what that request was.
I suppose that I'm thinking in terms of what you have to provide is access to good information, and that's extremely difficult, and that's what's not being provided. So I would argue, no, the individual who wants to have access to this help in ending their own life must have access to the best information, and that was not being provided, and still many people don't believe should be provided to people who, I would argue, have every right to exercise this option but need the information. So the question of who gets access to information is important. The idea that I had information about drugs, which is what Lisette and Nago told me because of my training, and yet then I was doling it out to people who satisfied my criteria of whether they had a good reason for accessing that information, was the position that she found so offensive, and which I now find quite offensive too. In other words, I would argue that everyone should have access to this best information. What they do with it then is up to them. Now, it turns out that if you've got access to the best information, you don't need much else. but you do have to have access to the best information. You don't have to effectively tie up the resources of anyone else other than the fact that you need to have that information. Now, there's moves to try and prevent the flow of that information, and that goes on all the time. And that then transfers into often access to the drugs that you might need to carry out that step.
The other thing that I thought about when you were giving your answer was, I guess, the method, right? You said that there was a machine eventually that you devised that made it into assisted suicide. Now, that makes me think of Kevorkian and his Mercitron. Did you get it inspired by that, or were you inspired by that?
I was a bit critical of Jack in those days. I don't know why. I actually admire the man. But I thought his machine could have been improved. And I think what I saw, my Deliverance machine, which is now in the British Museum, British Science Museum, looks a lot better than his, and it actually used a bit more recent technology. But basically, it was the same device. In Jack's machine, you just undid an alligator clip and the drugs flowed. In the so-called Deliverance machine, you pressed a button on the laptop and that activated a syringe driver and the drugs flowed. But it was the same thing, and it was effectively a copy of Jack's machine.
Do you think that he was right?
Jack, yeah, I had a lot of admiration for him, and I watched Fiedler, his lawyer, defend him in those earlier trials and carry out legal miracles there. But when Jack decided to go his own way and defend himself in the Michigan court, I was worried, with good reason, as it turned out, and I've had quite a bit to do with his assistant, who was with him during most of the deaths, Neil Nickel in Michigan, and we're still friends. And all of that period when Jack was in prison, Neil was there visiting relentlessly, and that's how I kept track of what was going on. And I think he was paying a pretty heavy price, probably for deciding to defend himself. I suspect it may not have had quite the same seriousness of the legal consequences had he stuck with Fiegler, but nevertheless, he was making a good point, but it was obviously not one that the legal system could accommodate.
So I kind of want to get your opinion on tough issues. So what role do you think does conscientious objection play?
Conscientious objection by who? I mean,
by a physician.
For not providing the information. I think they have every right not to provide that information if they don't wish, and I would respect that view. I'm not saying that doctors should be forced to divest this information or provide this information at all. Many doctors don't want to. Many doctors don't want to be involved in the whole assisted suicide debate, or even in certainly the practicalities of it as pieces of legislation spread around the world, and those rights need to be respected. So I don't have any difficulty with that idea. What I'm suggesting, though, is when the medical profession as a block then issues instructions to all doctors not to provide information, then I would be very careful about and concerned about that. And that's effectively what the medical board argued in Australia when they argued that when I tried to make this information more widely available, that I should be stripped of my medical qualifications and told that I couldn't actually practice medicine in Australia unless I took my authorship of a handbook which was providing that information to people. So it's the extent of that. Individuals refusing to be involved in providing information makes perfect sense.
Okay. So what about the case of infants who seem to be suffering and who are not going to live very long? Do you think that euthanasia is justified for them?
The question, yeah, I think it's justified. And I mean, I've had long talks with Peter Singer about his thoughts on this, and I don't have any trouble understanding or accepting his views on that. The question, it seems to me there, though, is the question of who makes the final decision. And clearly, if you're talking about infants who don't have, would not be believed to have so-called they've got mental decision-making ability because they haven't reached a period of their development where they understand, for example, the permanence of death. Maybe we're talking about extremely young infants, for example, people that have been born of serious birth defects and the like. The question then is who makes the decision? I don't have any trouble with the decision being made. By and large, I would support sensible moves to have some sort of recognised, sensible decision-making process. I can't see any problem with that. It's not an issue that I've had any personal experience with. dealing, in my case, almost entirely, well, totally with people that have reached adult years.
Okay, so what about a person who's very elderly and they're suffering from advanced dementia? Do you think assisted death could be justified in a case like that?
I think it'd be very hard. I'm not comfortable with the idea of the various strategies that are being talked about how one might resolve the so-called dementia dilemma. It seems to me that if you get yourself into a situation where you really do not know what it is you may or may not be about to agree with, in other words, you reach the stage of dementia where no one is going to say that you've got mental capacity. As far as I can see, you cannot go giving permission for someone to come along and end your life, or for that matter, have the ability to demand access to the information which would allow you to take that step, even if you could. So attempts to try and resolve this issue with the use of advanced directives here in the Netherlands haven't been very successful. I mean, I admire the Dutch for trying, and it is in some ways, I suppose, the obvious way to deal with it. You write down your wishes while you can. There was some sort of legally understandable and valid document which says that if I get to this stage, a doctor can end my life, and that's accepted here in the Netherlands. But I don't know any Dutch doctor who gets finds much enthusiasm with going around to the bedside of someone who doesn't know which way's up and which way's down, waving a piece of paper around which was signed 10 years ago saying that if I'm like this, kill me. Doctors don't like it. Doctors do it, and I know and talk to many, and I know what they go through. It's very difficult. I wouldn't want to be part of that. My feeling is that if you let that happen to the point where you do no longer have mental capacity, you miss the boat. You've lost your chance. I believe there is answers, but they have to be technological. They can't be dealt with through this rather simplistic approach of a piece of document in the form of an advanced directive.
What about the case of psychiatric patients?
Well, it's a pretty simple issue, I think. I think you've got to have mental capacity. Now, this mental capacity issue is a big one, and I spend a lot of time arguing with a lot of people, a lot of them psychiatrists, about what the hell mental capacity actually is. It's some sort of, they tell me, nebulous quality which we either have or we don't have. And it would seem, if you listen to psychiatrists, that they consider, many of them do, that they're the only people in the universe who can make that decision about whether you actually possess it or not. But it seems to be that there is this characteristic that a person either has or doesn't have about whether they can make decisions about where, how, if and how, and what the way that they act. In other words, do you have the ability to make a decision which you think is in your best interest? Now, if you have mental capacity, okay, then of course you should have access to the ways and means to be able to divest yourself of your own life. If you don't have mental capacity, well, then there's no point. You can't make that decision, and so you shouldn't be given access to the ways and means to carry out that process. Now, can you do that in the context of psychiatric illness? Well, of course you can, and that's where it starts to get a little bit murky, because there are many people who believe that you're even asking for some sort of information and assistance to end your life. You can't possibly have mental capacity, almost ipso facto by definition. And many psychiatrists still argue along those lines, but I think it's more or less, generally speaking, understood now that you can have all sorts of psychiatric diseases and still possess mental capacity, although there are certainly many psychiatric illnesses where you lose mental capacity. The classic psychiatric illnesses where you lose mental capacity are clearly the ones that everybody believes, but there are plenty of examples where a person can have quite serious psychiatric illnesses but still possess mental capacity. And in that instance, of course, they should be given the information and assistance and material means by which they can take this step of ending their life if that's what they wish.
One of the major criticisms that I hear against assisted death is that it will push many people who would otherwise continue to live to choose it. And the reason is that they are suffering from social injustices. So perhaps poverty may push some people to choose to take their own life. Perhaps lack of universal health care will push some people to take their own life, right? Perhaps discrimination.
Yeah, I think that's a I mean, these are valid concerns, and certainly it's being discussed quite a lot in the context of the Canadian situation now, where people are being reported as being driven to take this step because they're homeless and the like. And I suppose my feeling there to step back a little bit and to say, well, obviously the answer is to make sure that people don't feel so disadvantaged and possessed and treated in such a bad way by society. We should adjust those evils and injustices within society. But it's a little bit like saying we should fix the broader problem before we even consider the steps that they may take. And I think that that's one way, and it's an argument that's often used about why nobody should ever have the means and ability to be able to end their own life. We should go about fixing underlying problems which might take them or force them into a position where they wish to take the step. And if you look at the cases of physical illness, it's a bit like saying, well, you can't have health to be able to end your life in the context of this terminal cancer because there's a cure possibly just around the corner. So what you've got to do is wait around because that cure is about to be discovered and you will benefit from it. So that idea that we're going to close the door on anyone taking this option because there could be some change in circumstances which reverse the position that you're now taking with your rational mind is the one that concerns me. Now, if with your rational mind you've decided that life is so unjust and the conditions that you find yourself living with are so intolerable that death is the preferred choice and no one's about to try and change that, I think, of course, you must have the ability and option of being able to end your life. And it's a variation on the line I would take about people who we incarcerate under sentences of life without parole. We put people into situations and say, right, you've now got life without parole because you're such a bad person. And then we say, but you're not allowed to end that life. And I find that an equally unjustifiable situation or position that many in society take.
As far as I understand it, in Canada, 99% of their assisted death cases is euthanasia. I'm not entirely sure, if you think that that's ideal. It kind of sounds like that you think that there is this right, a quote-unquote God-given right that everybody has to be able to take their own life, right? And you believe that physicians have some obligation, although you can object, some obligation to give patients the correct information on how to end their life, okay? Now, that's somewhat different than you think that physicians ought to actively euthanize a patient.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know what you're mentioning now, something 90%. It's been going up over here in the Netherlands too, and I talk to a lot of Dutch doctors about the fact that the choice is here. You can actually drink some medication which will end your life, which I suppose, given that someone's given you the drugs, is seen as assisted suicide, or someone can come along and give you an injection, so-called lethal injection, which would be described as euthanasia. And a person who's effectively qualifies under Dutch law, which means you've got to be sick and suffering, that's what Dutch law says, it's not the same as the Swiss situation, then what we're effectively doing there is turning assisted suicide, where you drink something, into a situation of euthanasia, where someone comes along, a doctor, generally speaking, gives you a lethal injection. And and the fact that 99% of people over here are moving, or more and more people every year are moving towards the lethal injection, troubles me a great deal, because what I think's going on, and I get this feeling that this is something which many other people think might be also the reason behind it, is that people are trying, because they're now confronting their own death and their own end of their lives, to try and get someone other than themselves to share in the decision-making process. Now, if you've been given a drug and you mix it up and you've got a drink sitting in front of you and you can drink it or you can throw it down the sink, I suppose you could argue, well, I've shared that decision-making with the person who gave me the drug, but it's not quite as clear-cut as in a situation where someone comes along and puts a needle in your vein and stands there with the syringe saying, shall I go ahead? You say yes, and they push the plunger on the syringe and you end your life. That's a much, it seems to me, clearer situation where I feel that people are getting some comfort, that is the person that's elected to have this lethal injection, with the idea that the decision that they're taking is one that they can co-share with the person who's providing the lethal injection. It's a way of divesting yourself of the responsibility, sharing it out, making it less onerous. Oh my God, what if I've done the wrong thing? Now, I'm of the opinion, if you want to end your life, I'll support that. I'll give you all the ways and means, everything you need, but I'm not going to push the plunger. I don't see why you should ask me to push the plunger when you can push the plunger. If you want to die, good. I understand it. Respect it. We'll facilitate it. But don't say to me that I've got to be part of the process. I'm part of the process in giving you the ways and means, but don't put on me a situation where you want me to share in the actual procedure.
Interesting. Okay. And why don't you want to be an active participant in that way?
I don't think you've got, I think you've got a right to have access to the information, the ways and means to be able to end your life, but you have no right to put that. I don't think that your decision to end your own life is something that you have any so-called right to inflict on other people or to try and involve other people in the decision-making process. You make the decision. You've got mental capacity. You can make such a decision. It might be right, it might be wrong, but you make the decision. And you live with the decision or die with the decision. But don't try and share it around a bit and try and get other people to effectively endorse your decision. And that's what I fear is going on here. Now, I also think that there's people are understandably worried about messing things up, and I see it all the time. We have people all the time really troubled and worried that they might make a mess of it because when asked what they want, they say, look, I want something which is peaceful, but heavens, I also want something which is reliable. It's got to work. I don't want something that might work. I want something that will work. I don't want to half die. I want to die. Now, that concern that something might go wrong is not an unjustified worry. I mean, I can understand why people are concerned about it. And I guess that's also driving people's wish to have some other, if you like, experienced person carry out the so-called act. My concern is that effectively that's inviting me to become an executioner, and I don't want to do that. I'm saying, look, with the right information, with the best technology, with the best information, you don't need a person with a white coat standing there supervising the procedure. You've just got to take the responsibility for yourself, and you can do it. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince people that they are capable of carrying out this step themselves, and they won't mess it up. It will be a success. And the idea of trying to alleviate this anxiety by having someone standing there, I can understand, but I don't fully support. It's one of the reasons why we are involved with lots of people going to Switzerland. And people like the fact that in Switzerland, you don't have to be sick, so you don't have to satisfy those sorts of medical prerequisites, but you will have the expert standing there. And I feel that that's really the motivation there is not so much the fact that they're getting someone to share the decision-making, but rather the comfort of knowing that the expert will make sure that there's no mistake.
I wonder if your feeling about this issue is influenced by your moral judgment of euthanasia, right? Because let's take the opposite scenario. Let's say there's a person who's dying and they could be saved. And you say, well, I can give you the information so that you can save yourself. You can save yourself like totally fine and reliably, but I'm not going to participate in saving your life. I'm not going to do it directly. That would seem weird, right? So that suggests to me that it's almost like you don't think that one particular act is necessarily morally good.
Well, when you say I'm not going to participate in saving your life, the question is, well, what am I supposed to do to save your life? I mean, what I'm saying in the case of the lethal injection is you can do this yourself. Now, okay, someone will have to put a needle into your vein, and I don't mind a doctor doing that, or for that matter, a nurse, or for that matter, you're doing it yourself. That's fine. What I'm saying is I have no objections to that. But when it comes to pressing the syringe, you've got to do that. Now, you're saying, well, what about the person who says, oh, here's something which will cure your illness or something, but you can do it yourself? Well, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you need the team of specialists to administer this new under medical cure. And of course, those team of medical specialists would involve themselves and enthusiastically participate in saving your life. But this is not a case where you need expertise to be able to end your life. You've just got to have access to the best equipment and the best drugs.
So it sounds like that you're not in favor of the medicalization of assisted death.
I've watched the medical profession closely in my years of being involved, and I'm skeptical about many of the activities. When, as I mentioned earlier, when the first chance of a piece of legislation came up so many years ago, it was the opposition of the medical profession to the whole process that effectively ended that short-lived piece of legislation in Australia. It was the medical profession plus the church, but the medical profession came out so strongly saying, we are going to have nothing to do with such a law. This is counter to everything we believe in. Now, that aspect of the medical profession's behaviour made me sceptical. Then I've watched over the years that is in Australia, for example, they've come around to the idea, okay, well, we can involve ourselves in very select situations, basically where you're terminally ill and you're satisfied, doesn't have a criteria, and we all sit around and we have a decision. We judge whether or not we think you're suffering enough for us to give you the help that you feel you're entitled to. So I've watched the medical profession sort of change its position and come around now to being involved, but now they want to run the show. And that's exactly what's happened. From having no involvement, not wanting to participate and effectively wrecking that first piece of law back in 95, they're now in a situation as a profession where they basically make the decisions about who moves and who doesn't move. In other words, they're the gatekeepers of the procedure. And I'm incredibly skeptical about that, because that effectively means that the profession has set itself up as the gatekeepers to death and dying, and they're not. And I would argue that death and dying is a natural process, and it shouldn't be something which needs to be controlled by some particular elite group within society who set themselves up as preordained gatekeepers of the procedure.
So according to your review, anybody who's an adult and who has capacity should be able to access this information. Do you think that there should be any other safeguards? So for instance, one is to the access of the information, and two is the access to the resources to perform the act. Do you see a difference between the two?
No, I think that, there's clearly a material difference. You can have all the information, but if you can't get the means, it's a bit valueless. And so you do need information, and then you do need the ability to get access to the materials that you need. And generally speaking, we're talking about access to certain drugs. And I would argue that people should have access to the information, certainly, and access to the drugs. Now, that's provided they satisfy these criteria that I mentioned.
Okay. So that means somebody has to assess the patient's capacity, correct?
Yeah, that's the one, and that's a big problem.
Okay, so that means there still has to be medical involvement.
We're working very hard on trying to get the doctors out of this process, and I think we're getting somewhere. We believe there are other ways of assessing mental capacity besides spending half an hour sitting at the feet of a psychiatrist, and I don't value that argument that this is such a hard decision to make, that the only people in the universe who can make such a decision are those people that have had psychiatric training and qualification. It is a difficult decision to make, a mental capacity test, although I might add that when it comes to facing the consequences of legal misdemeanor, the courts assume that you've got mental capacity by the mere fact that you're functioning in society. You've got to argue damn hard to try and escape some sort of legal repercussions for your crimes by saying you don't have mental capacity. Yet when it comes to ending your own life, you've got to argue equally hard in the other direction that you do have mental capacity, and that the only people that can give you a tick and allow you to move forward are that very select group within the medical profession. So I'm skeptical about this. I'm sure that there are some clever pieces of software which will do a better job of assessing mental capacity than most of the psychiatrists that I know and I have watched and have dealings with as they make these decisions on a daily basis.
Interesting. So when you say software, you mean artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
So
in
you're
the same way that we can scan, we can artificially scan the scans of people's breasts and find tumors, as well as, or probably better than, the radiologist studying the plate. Software can do a better job. I've got a fair idea that clever software could do a better job. As I said, we're working on it. We've spent a bit of time and money on it. We're not getting as far as we want to get on it. And certainly it comes as part of the so-called SARCO project that I'm involved in, because I want to actually take out, you're right, that is still one area where we find that this particular group, that is, in this case, the medical profession, are saying, no, we make this decision. Now, someone's got to make the decision, I agree. The question is, who does it? And how do we make sure that it's not subject to the bias of the particular adjudicating authority?
So what are you imagining then of what it looks like on the ground? A person goes into a pharmacy and they sit in a room in front of a computer, and the computer assesses their capacity at that moment. And if the computer says that this patient has capacity, then they should be able to buy these drugs at the pharmacy.
Yeah, I think something along those lines. I'm working on the my Sarco machine, which uses gas, but effectively it's kind of like that. They will do the software test. If the software test indicates that they have passed, in other words, that they've got so-called mental capacity, at least at the moment they carry out the test, understanding that these so-called mental capacity may change with time. But given that they have it at that point and they decide they wish to die, the software issues them with a code. That code allows the device to work, which is sort of variation on what you're saying. They would be issued a code which would allow them to have the drugs. The difference, I would say, though, is that after 24 hours, then you've got to do the test again. Now, that's all right as far as my so-called Sarco machine is concerned, because the machine stops working after 24 hours, and then you've got to go and do the test again. Whereas if someone's issued you the lethal drugs from the pharmacy because you had you had passed your test, I don't know how you're going to work. We have to work out some way where you'd have to hand the tablets in or redo another test, something like that, to monitor this ongoing and fluctuating characteristic of capacity.
What is this Sarco machine that you're talking about?
The Sarco machine is a device which I've been working on for a long time, but it came about because of the lawyers for a man who was dying in London some while back. It was seriously disabled, argued that he had been deprived of his right to suicide. The argument being that suicide is not a crime. Everybody should be able to suicide was the argument the lawyers ran, but he had serious disability with locked-in syndrome, so he couldn't physically end his own life. And they asked me, because of my background in so-called developing machines and bits of technology, whether or not we could build a device which would allow a significantly disabled person without assistance to die. In other words, without access to hard-to-get, heavily controlled drugs, without some skilled person getting needles into veins and the like. And so we built the so-called Sarco machine. It's got quite a bit of publicity around the place, but basically it's a stylish and elegant machine which you climb in and press a button. And what it does is immediately floods the capsule, which was initially considered to be your coffin, but it won't be now. But it's a 3D printed device. You climb in, press a button. It floods the capsule with it drops the oxygen level in the capsule to less than 1% very quickly, and you die rapidly and peacefully. Now, for the machine to work, you've got to enter a 4-digit code into the keypad, and that 4-digit code is generated by, if we ever get it working in a way that other people are even convinced is a good approximation of a mental capacity identifier, that test will have to be done to give you the access code.
I see. Okay, I think I did read something about it. It's basically a suicide pod, right?
Yeah, suicide pod, and it basically, it just follows or mimics a method which has been used a lot over the years in the right to die movement of people using plastic bags. But this is an attempt to make it look a lot more stylish and elegant, make it look quite attractive, make it look like a vehicle that's going somewhere. The first one's built, it's sitting here and about to be used in Switzerland. So that's the situation we're at now.
Okay, and this suicide pod, people can 3D print?
Yes, and that's another thing, because if I built this pod, which I've done, and give it to someone even in the Netherlands with its progressive legislation, that would be assisting a suicide in the Netherlands, and then the Dutch authorities would move against me. So the idea, and that's true in just about every country except Switzerland, so just running around building machines and giving to other people isn't very clever. But what we can do is give information, because it's generally been seen that the provision of information doesn't usually attract some form of legal sanction. And so by publishing how you can build your own, in other words, 3D print in this case, by giving away the program so that anyone can take it to a printer and build their own, then you've effectively constructed your own means to an electric, peaceful, reliable and stylish death at the time of your choosing. So that's why we're 3D printing. Really, so we can distribute the idea. Now, the first one can be used in Switzerland, because that country, it's not a crime for me to give the device to another person. That's what will happen.
So you really do have a very liberal view on assisted death, right? Everybody should be able to 3D print this. Everybody should be able to have access to it as long as they're adults and have decision-making capacity.
Well, that is the two criteria that I identified at the start. Now, my own organisation doesn't necessarily feel quite as enthusiastic about my beliefs as I do, and we in the organisation I set up called Exit International have imposed a kind of 50-year age limit for people accessing the organisation, accessing our workshops, accessing the latest information. That wasn't something that I thought was a hell of a good idea, but I mean, I can sort of see the reason partly from that is the fact that, generally speaking, younger people, when they end their lives, it upsets a lot of people. And if some way or other you are seen as responsible for younger people ending their lives, taking what might be a rational decision to divest themselves of their life, you can be left with a lot of angry people around who feel that you've somehow or other cut short the lives of people they love and care about. As a way of dealing with this, our organisation has imposed this age limit with the rather nebulous criteria that it's because that decides whether or not you've had, quote, significant life experience. Now, I guess that makes sense. I can sort of see why you should have significant life experience before you make this most final of final decisions. But I note somewhat wryly that we're quite the distress caused by 18-year-olds, 90-year-olds, 20-year-olds who suicide in society, which I watch around the world, the distress that causes isn't balanced by us saying they should never have been given the information or access to the ways and means that they've taken this step. And we're watching two very important trials about to start, one in Toronto and one here in the Netherlands, of people that have made access to the material for younger people to take this step now play out in the law courts. But there's not the same level of revulsion. I find some inconsistency here by those same people when we talk about the fact we're quite happy to give 18-year-olds guns and tell them to go to other countries and kill people we don't like. That seems to be quite part and parcel of our civilized society. But heaven help us if we suggest that those same people should be given the information whereby they can direct that same force against their own bodies.
Are you afraid of abuse? Do you think it's likely?
Abuse as in...
the abuse of the technology. So like there's these suicide pods, a bunch of people 3D print them, and they're somehow being misused.
Well, it's hard to see how they could be misused. I mean, I suppose someone with a gun could force you to climb in and press a button, I suppose, but that would be considered to be murder, I would imagine. I mean, if it's hard to see how they can be abused. It's hard. I can't. You have to have mental capacity. You have to be an adult. They're the criteria that I find essential. Initially, I'm sure my organisation will endeavour to try and restrict access to this information to people over the age of 50. I don't know how that's going to go. But in any event, if that were the case, I would feel extremely comfortable with it.
If the 3D print model is available, like once it's made available, then there's no stopping it, right? Then it just exists on the internet and everybody's going to be able to have access to it. It's kind of like 3D models for guns, right? Like if you had the blueprint, anybody with a 3D printer can print their own gun. So now you live in a society where even more people have guns. You know, like I would be afraid of abuse in that case.
Yeah, I would be too. I mean, guns are very good at being used to harm other people. I don't see quite how one uses the sarcopod to abuse other people. It's very hard to see how this could be described as a weapon.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it would necessarily be a weapon, and it's maybe I just don't have a good enough imagination. I'm not entirely sure how people would abuse it either, but perhaps maybe somebody could hack it, right? And then so it makes it easier to access. And so somebody who doesn't necessarily would pass a decision-making capacity assessment would be able to, take their own life, something like that.
Well, I guess that's true. I mean, I guess that may be possible. I point out that people have had access to rope for a long time and they know how to hang themselves on. I mean, we don't go through the same agony of worrying about whether or not people should have access to rope and the means of how you can use a piece of rope to kill yourself. We just accept the fact that there is rope out there. People know how to hang themselves, and quite a lot of people do. The idea that we should in some way or other try and restrict access to the ways and means to take this pretty final step is considered to be a waste of time or meaningless. And I think that it really doesn't flow that we shouldn't be looking at perhaps better ways, or ways which people do find as rather more attractive, to be able to come to this most important final day of their lives in this way, which I describe as stylish and elegant, turning it into a sense of occasion, turning it into a special day with something that looks good, looks nice, and surrounded by friends, people you want to be there as you wave goodbye and you climb into your capsule and you're going and they're staying. I think that's probably something which a lot of people would rather prefer than going down and buying a piece of rope. And I certainly don't think they'd have much luck trying to get friends and family standing around while they hung themselves. So, I mean, I find the whole idea of trying to make it something which is appealing to the person who's going to take this step, so that they don't feel any requirement to hide themselves away in some form of shame, is important.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how much the optics of the act influences your position, right? Because like you said, like we have rope. People have killed themselves forever, right? There are all these different means for people to take their own lives. Why do we need something like a suicide pod that you can 3D print, right? And you're saying it's the optics.
Yes, entirely. It's to make the process something which people feel comfortable with and find the whole process something which they wish to be part of, that they can turn this most important day, as I said, into a sense of occasion. You have total ability to choose the time. So it's an elective process. You can pick the time, you can pick the place. And you can turn this day, not from something that you have to spend your life fearful of, but into something which, because it is planned, is elective, where you control, and turn it into something which you can not exactly welcome, but perhaps something which you certainly needn't shy away from.
What do you think would change your mind on this issue?
Well, I've watched my own evolution of thinking, and so, of course, the people that have known me for many years, as my views change, and usually they've all been changed because of experience, and lots of experience, I suppose, now with people that are making this step and making the decision to die. What would change it? I suppose there will be other examples of people coming along and expressing views which will challenge and make me forced to reconsider and perhaps reflect. If, for example, as you just suggested, what if this new device were in some way abused, hacked, or in some way or other found to be able to be used in one way or other that we hadn't anticipated? Well, of course, it'd be important to reconsider. I mean, I'm certainly not saying my ideas are locked in concrete, and I hope they're not, and that they will always be affected by and altered by new experiences and new information, and things are changing. As I said, I'm welcoming a time when we have access to ways of determining mental capacity that don't require psychiatrists. I'm welcoming implanted devices that can deal with the dementia dilemma, the technological solutions to dementia. I will see a world where people can deal with these issues with clever use of technologies being an infinitely better one than the way we stumble through these disasters now.
So of all the different countries that have legalized some form of assisted death, which one do you think has it the closest?
Switzerland.
Switzerland?
It's the only country which has a rights model as opposed to a medical model piece of legislation. By rights model, it's considered that you have a right to assistance. Now, Germany is, because of laws that have recently been passed in Germany, they seem to be mirroring the situation in Switzerland, but they're unique. Every other country, including the so-called progressive nations like the Netherlands, have got medicalised laws. In other words, they set up the medical profession as the judge and jury as to who gets access to assistance. You have to be suffering, and some adjudicating authority, usually a panel of doctors, one or two or whoever, will make the decision as to whether or not you satisfy their criteria of whether your suffering is sufficient. No good going along saying you want to die because you want to die. That doesn't cut it here in the Netherlands. And we find this over and over with people saying, why do I have to satisfy these fake or false or medicalised criteria? And that is the issue. People are going in large numbers to Switzerland because that is not a condition. We have couples going to Switzerland where they want to die together because even though one may be very sick and certainly able to satisfy the criteria of assisted dying laws in whichever country they come from, their partner who wants to die at the same time doesn't or isn't sick. And so they are not eligible even, for example, under Dutch law. So unless you start to fabricate or make up some sort of illness and convince some Dutch doctor that you are suffering because your husband's dying and want to die at the same time, you don't get help here in the Netherlands. But in Switzerland, that is not an issue. It's a much better model, and I spend a lot of time these days running around talking to various committees and inquiries by countries thinking about bringing in laws, arguing for them, for goodness sake, have a close look at Switzerland before you just go down the same old path, which everyone has gone down ever since back in 1995 in Darwin, of bringing in medicalised laws.
So for Switzerland, what are the criteria?
Well, you've got to have mental capacity, and that's generally adjudicated in a traditional way. And you've got to be able to start the process yourself. So someone can put a needle in your vein and load up the drugs and everything, but you have to turn on the little tap. You can't have the doctor push the plunge or anything like that. If you have a drink, say of pentobarbital barbiturates, such as they use in Dignitas, they will put the glass on the table and say, there, if you want to drink it, drink it. If you don't want to drink it, throw it down the sink and you can go home. The other words, you must carry out the process. You must have mental capacity. And you've got to be an adult. I mean, these are the criteria under the Swiss law. It's a very broad law that assistance to end one's life is not a crime if that assistance is provided without malice or malicious intent. That's the basis of that law, which has been in place since 1936 or 37.
Okay. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. This has been a very intriguing and engaging conversation.
Good, I enjoyed it.